Hello everyone. In the previous lecture, we have been trying to form an overview of the idea of Aucitya. We know that the English word that can approximate to the notion of Aucitya is propriety or decorum. The word Aucitya referred to two things in poetics. First of all, it meant the discretion of the creative writer about the choice of correct aesthetic components that suits the context. It also meant the amalgamation of acceptable social practices in society. We saw that the notion of Aucitya was central to Sanskrit poetics right from Bharata onwards. A detailed review of the history of the concept of Aucitya showed us that it was an important concept throughout the history of Sanskrit poetics or literary theory. We have also seen that the idea of Aucitya is not a static concept in the sense that what is proper today will be improper tomorrow. We noted that insistence on adherence to propriety did not mean that impropriety should always be removed from the ambit of literature altogether. In the context of presenting athama characters or inferior characters, impropriety was a desirable element. We discussed that the idea of propriety functioned in literary theory in two ways. First, Kavya-shastra gave the creative writers a clear mandate as to how to portray character types and emotions. Sometimes they even asked the writers to refer to scholarly texts which detail the acceptable practices within a field of knowledge to conform to the notion of Aucitya in the realm of poetics. The second method was the elimination of an improper action committed by a noble character. This method was generally used when the creative writers were retelling an already existing story with an impropriety. The next question that we discussed was the necessity of insistence on the observation of Aucitya on the part of the noble characters. Why did literary theoreticians insisted that creative writers should always conform to the idea of Aucitya? In this regard, we saw that Kavya was also seen as a mechanism to instruct the readers about dharma vidhi or the right way of living. But unlike the Veda and Shastras which explicitly instructed the readers, Kavya instructed the readers implicitly. How did it implicitly instruct the readers? Kavya always presented that the noble hero who conforms to the notion of Aucitya emerge victorious over the athama villain who rejects impropriety altogether. Naturally, a reader who reads a Kavya composed in this manner will be inspired by the dharmic ways and manners of the noble hero. There is no doubt about it. In this lecture, we are going to see the specific observations of various literary theoreticians with respect to the idea of Aucitya. The first theoretician we are going to discuss in this respect is Bhamaha. Although Bhamaha's observations about the concept of Aucitya are very limited, we cannot actually completely ignore him. I have already mentioned that Bhamaha's ideas about the notion of Aucitya are in the form of his reflections about Kavya dosha or poetic faults or blemishes. We have discussed it in detail when we talked about gunas and doshas, so I do not intend to repeat them again here. Here, I will be primarily dealing with some of his observations with respect to the representation of heroes and villains in Kavya. It seems that Bhamaha is generally in favor of the popular method of presenting heroes as the embodiment of all the good qualities. He is not in favor of presenting either the hero or the villain as individuals representing both gunas and doshas. While describing the genre called Katha, Bhamaha observes that a hero talking about his own qualities and merits will not suit his noble birth. So, the achievements and merits of the hero should be narrated by someone else. But he says that this is acceptable in Akhyayika. It seems from this apparent contradiction that Bhamaha has not thought really much about this concept of Aucitya in detail. Pama is also against the practice of a noble hero with all the qualities being killed at the end of the story. Pamaha observes, after having first placed a Nayaka by extolling his ancestry, prowess, etc., do not narrate his destruction with the object of enhancing the glory of another character. Pamaha further asks, if the hero is not intended to dominate the whole poem and is not to participate in the final success, it is useless to describe him in great glory in the beginning. Pamaha also warns the poets against using instances that go against common sense of the readers. He calls the poet's propensity for incorporating things against common sense ayuktimat. For example, Pamaha says that poets should not present the cloud, the wind, the bee, the parrot, etc. as messengers. These entities and birds cannot speak legibly and cannot travel for a long distance. Then, that being the case, Pamaha asks, how can they act as messengers? Pamaha observes that there are exceptions to this rule. For example, if the person who sends the message is intoxicated or mentally deranged, then he or she may end up choosing a non-sentient entity or a bird or an animal as the messenger. When we discussed the concept of Alankara, we saw that Pamaha gave great importance to Adishayokti or hyperbole. Although he gave greater importance to hyperbole, he says that one should not mix hyperbole and the improbable. We can see Pamaha's concern about Aucitya in poetic folds with respect to Upama or simile as well. Since it is a relatively big section, I will focus only on the idea of impossible and simile. Pamaha opines that it is improper to compare a situation to a highly improbable situation that is against the common sense of the readers. He gives us an example in this respect. This example comes from a situation where a king is showing his skill in archery. The poet says that the burning arrows coming from the middle of the king's bended bow looked as if they issued from the face of the king, just as streams of rain appeared to fall from the noonday sun. Pamaha asks, how could a stream of water issue from the sun? This is an improbable situation. So, according to Pamaha, no man of sense will make a comparison with an improbable thing. Doshas such as desha-virotha or observations that contradict the facts regarding a place, kala-viroda or poetic fault arising from the lack of one's knowledge of art, nyaya-viroda or observations that go against the set rules pertaining to dharma, artha and kama, or agama-viroda or the statements that contradict the precepts in dharma shastra, etc., clearly represent his observations about Aucitya. Pamaha compares a poet to a garland maker. While stringing together a garland maker very carefully selects sweet-smelling, beautiful-looking flowers. He also knows how to identify and reject the ordinary ones. He has also good knowledge of the shape and color of the flowers. He knows where to place what color in the garland to enhance the beauty of the garland. In the same manner, while composing a kavya, a poet should take abundant care to select the appropriate words and place them in their right position in order to produce a charming kavya. As in Pamaha's Kavya Alangara, Dandin's Kavya Darsha also contains observations about the notion of Aucitya without really using the term Aucitya. Dandin's observations regarding Aucitya are expressed through the idea of Kavya doshas or poetic faults. We have already discussed it in detail when we discussed in the section on gunas and doshas. So here I will be dealing with some aspects with respect to the representation of heroes, which I have not covered in the previous section. Dandin observes that a hero should be an embodiment of all the good qualities, and the poet should make sure that such a hero emerges victorious at the end of the story. Unlike Bhamaha, he is not against ascribing courage, education and nobility to a villain. Dandin thinks that such an approach will always enhance the quality of the hero when the former wins over the latter. Dandin does not find fault with the hero becoming the speaker of the story either. According to Bhamaha, a hero should consciously stay away from describing his own achievements. But Dandin does not support this view. He says that the hero does not need to shy away from speaking about the actual things that had happened in his life. So, Dandin is also against using rustic and uncouth expressions in Kavya. We have already seen this, so I don't intend to speak about this at great length. Vamana's observations about Aucitya are also encoded in Kavya Dosha. We have seen it to a great extent in the section on Kavya Gunas and Doshas. However, I would like to briefly talk about some of his observations with respect to social propriety here. Vamana's observations about the importance of a poet conforming to the normalized truth claims of society recorded in Shastras in fact typifies how Kavishiksha functioned in preconditioning a poet the way Aucitya demanded. The dosha that Vamana refers to as Vidya Viruddham or opposition to dominant knowledge systems is clearly an attempt to condition the poets according to the notions of social propriety of the period. Vamana opines that any representation of facts against what is written in Shastras will be a blotch on Kavya, there is no doubt about it. To demonstrate the poetic blemish called Vidya Viruddham and warn the poets against it, Vamana cites a few examples. According to Dharma Shastra, it is to restore justice that kings conquer the world. If a poet says that it is to satiate their material desires that kings conquer the other countries, that will result in a poetic blemish. According to Danda Shastra Nidhi, it is because of a person's prudent conduct and diplomacy that others succumb to him or her. But if someone says that it is a person's aggressiveness that enables him to win over others, then definitely it clashes with the socially accepted norm of Danda Shastra Nidhi and consequently results in the poetic blemish of contradicting Chadurvarga Shastra. He gives another example which is actually at war with Kama Shastra. According to Kama Shastra, lower lip or Athara is the right place to kiss, not the upper lip or Uttaroshtha. Contrary to this dictum in Kama Shastra, if a poet states that the upper lip is the right place to kiss, then the poet will court a poetic blemish. Vamana's injunction that a poet should always pay heed to these Shastras, which draw a neat line between what is acceptable and unacceptable within a social framework, is something which runs through the whole system of Sanskrit poetics like a red thread. The poet who got trained in the Kavya Shastra was thus encouraged to produce the cultural artifact in the way Aucitya preferred. We can undoubtedly say that this pedagogical practice always served as an effective tool in the Sanskrit literary circle to make creative writers compliant and to suppress any deviant representation of character types and emotions. This kind of prescriptivism not only suppressed the emergence of alternative ideologies, but it also predetermined the nature of character types and their actions even before a kavya was actually composed. In other words, even though the name and the local habitation of the characters and the objects changed from kavya to kavya, their representation was predetermined by the laws of propriety or Aucitya. By its insistence on the suitability of all aspects of literature from the word to character traits, Aucitya preempted any attempt in Sanskrit literary tradition to pose a resistance to the truth claims endorsed by the dominant power structure. We have seen the observations of Rudrada briefly in the previous lecture in connection with the observation that Aucitya is not a Nitya dosha. Although Rudrada was the first literary theoretician to use the term Aucitya to refer to impropriety, his engagement with the notion of Aucitya was very minimal. However, I think that it's good to reflect upon his observations on Aucitya before we proceed to Anandavarthana, who is considered the first literary theoretician to systematically approach the idea of propriety using the term Aucitya. It's significant to note that Rudrada's observations are very minimal, so we will be seeing them in detail. For example, Rudrada says that a poet should have what is appropriate and inappropriate by learning poetic meter, grammar, lokashakti or the ways of the world, vocabulary, etc. What he calls yukta yukta viveka is Aucitya. He is of the view that a poet attains this quality through vyutpatti or training. The following are some of his suggestions with respect to Aucitya. A poet should be careful to choose words with beauty that can brighten up the whole poetic composition. The poet should also be particular about using words whose meaning suits the context. Rudrada also warns the poets against replacing an important rasa that suits the context with another rasa that is relatively unimportant in that context. Particularly important is his engagement with a poetic fault or dosha called gramya. Gramya is the kind of dosha or poetic blemish that arises out of impropriety with respect to clan, caste, education, brilliance, social position, costume, stature, etc. It seems that with a reference to this poetic blemish called Gramya, Rudrada is invoking Bharata's dictum that a character should wear costumes according to their age, should walk according to their costume, and should speak according to their gait. He is implicitly stating that one should be attentive to the idea of Aucitya. Soon, in the next lecture, we will have a detailed engagement with the notion of Aucitya as we find it in Anandavarthana's Dhvanyaloka. Anandavarthana deserves a special mention because he is the first literary theoretician to systematically reflect upon the notion of Aucitya in Sanskrit poetics. I hope you have understood this lesson. Thank you.